All right, so now we're picking up on chapter 7. This is here it says early republic, and your new edition is actually called strengthening the union. This is the very beginnings. Shortly after Washington is elected, after Adams loses his first term, we have Jefferson coming into play. This is what the U.S. is going to look like in 1800. There's 5 million people in the next 20 years or so. Roughly the Trans-Appalachian Mountain area. When we say Trans-Appalachians, we mean the Appalachian Mountains, of course, which are roughly right here, kind of separating the 13 colonies. You can see the population density and where there's mountains. Of course, it's going to be less. The area Trans-Appalachian is on the other side of that. That's going to go from 300,000 to 2 million. And by 1840, about halfway through this century that we're talking about of U.S. history, 40% of people live on that side. So it's pretty amazing. The original 13 colonies are here. But within 40 years, 40% of the population will actually be on the other side. So growing rapidly. We also go from agricultural nation, 76, strictly agriculture. 1830, we're a commercial nation. We're making more money, more people in this profession. It's a commercial nation versus agriculture, which has huge implements. And that's something that you got to wonder if Thomas Jefferson would even be happy about at all. But nonetheless, talking about Jefferson, this is how he's going to run his office. He wants to weaken the federal government. Does not agree with the idea of a strong central government at all, right? Remember, it's this Democrat Republic, Jefferson, guys, and the guys who are against the Federalists and Hamilton's views. So in order to shrink the federal government, he's going to slash the budget. If they don't have a budget, they can't control anything. They're not as strong. I also believes in that strict constitutional interpretation, word from word. He is just like other Democrat Republicans are worried that if you start suggesting that one thing in the Constitution can mean different things, it opens up a gate and the federal government could do anything based on that. And so they're worried about that. So they want strict interpretation. He's going to be the first president to pursue the role of party leader. You think of Jefferson, you think of Washington and Adams. They didn't do that. They went out to lead their party. Washington had no party. Adams was a Federalist by far, but they didn't have a official party where they were trying to lead it and say, I'm the leader of the party, I represent that party. Not like we did with Jefferson and here on out after that. Also, this is his first party shift. If you do recall, Adams does have a Federalist ideology, and now the Democrat Republic ideology comes into play. And it's interesting because it's the first time we see a shift in political parties, which is more than just a shift in one person with power than just a president. We always talk about how this so dramatically changed between Washington and Adams, how power is peacefully transferred. When it's peacefully transferred in between political parties, I would argue that's a far bigger deal. He's going to try to get congressional support to actually lead his party, not just take over and say he commands it. And this is actually a close election. We believe that our founding fathers actually expected most of the time the elections to be close and go to the House. That way, the actual leader of the country would be chosen by the House in case that the appropriate one would actually be chosen. They expected it to always be close. This is a rendering of the White House. Jefferson always made fun of it. You can see from his quote. Jefferson was, remember, that common guy, didn't believe in bowing to the president, didn't believe all that stuff. He was a more average Joe kind of guy. He thought this White House was way too big. He says big enough for 2 emperors, a pope, and the Grand Lama. But that's not even counting after they added on to it after Jefferson. But he is, when he moves to D.C., he'll be the president, and the White House will actually be completed for the first time. Adams is the first one to move there, but it's not. D.C.'s not even finished. It's pretty poor off. Hey, how's it going?
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm actually recording a lecture for the kiddos.
I'll let you go then.
Sorry. All right, I'll cut that out later. All right, so Jefferson. He does have one issue to deal with when he's president. In that case, it's what we call Adams. His nickname, Adams' Midnight Appointments. So Adam, before he left president, if you remember, he lost election in November, but he doesn't actually leave office until March. In between that time period, when he knows he's not coming back, he's going to do everything he can to save the Federalist Party. And we talked about how he appoints Chief Justice John Marshall as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And the list went on and on about a whole bunch of judges he appoints, Federalist judges. This is how he ensures Federalists survive. Well, it was a very long list of judges he appoints. And the way it worked back then is he writes a letter and he sends it off to them. He was writing those letters up until the last minute. That's why it's called midnight appointments. The last minute, he's still writing his letters. In doing so, he actually creates an issue because not all those letters were mailed out. Right? As a matter of fact, one of the judges named Marbury never received his letter that Adams had written. So Marbury wants his letter, but it turns out Madison is a Secretary of State. And Madison was told by Jefferson to halt those letters, stop right now, don't send a single one out. So now we have a conflicting problem. One administration had appointed somebody, a judge. This next administration comes in and says, nope, we're not sending that communication to them. So in that sense, what is right or what is wrong, the legality of it gets confusing. So Marbury says, you know what, I'll sue the Supreme Court. This is between government issues and we'll take it to the Supreme Court. And the reason why he does that is the first Congress that met in 1789, they passed an act. It isn't an amendment. This is a bill. It's an act. And when they passed it, they gave the Supreme Court writ of mandamus, which is a Latin term. And essentially it means an order from a court to any government official below them in a lower court, anything to do a specific act that is that they have to do by law. So the court can order you to do something, essentially. That's what they can do. And so Marbury sues the Supreme Court because he wants the Supreme Court to order Madison to give him that letter so he can be a judge. To him, it's fair. Okay? And Jefferson said, nope, that was the last guy, not us. Okay? So John Marshall has to figure out what he's going to do. Remember, he's a Federalist. So he was appointed by Adams. He's Federalist Party. Should he help his other Federalists out? But if he does this, does it taint the Supreme Court? You know, if we're just going to play by politics, the Supreme Court is going to rule by politics, and you can't have that. This is a real issue he has to deal with. So he sits there and trying to figure out what to do with it. In a stroke of genius, he becomes the most famous Supreme Court Chief Justice with his court case. He decides that, hey, the Judicial Act of 1789, the one Congress passed that gave him the writ of mandamus, he goes, you can't give me powers like that. As a matter of fact, in the Constitution, it says you can't give me powers. So because I don't really have this power, and you can't give me that power, I can't hear this court case, so I'm going to throw it out. So what he did in that sense was he looked to see if that was constitutional. He said, you know what? Congress can't do that to me. That's not constitutional. Congress can't make those powers, can't write that bill. That bill is unconstitutional and get rid of it. And just like that, he establishes judicial review. Judicial review is when the Supreme Court will look at any law that's passed, say, is that constitutional? Everything in our lives revolves around this to this very day. This is what Supreme Court even does today with everything. Is Roe versus Wade constitutional? Is same-sex marriage constitutional? Is the Second Amendment, if somebody takes away your guns, is that violating the Second Amendment? Would it be unconstitutional? Everything that you could possibly think of goes to the Supreme Court. And at any time, if any government, any authority makes a law or persecutes you on something that is unconstitutional, it can go up to the Supreme Court and they will rule it unconstitutional. Marbury versus Madison is a court case that sets up judicial review, and the mastermind behind that was John Marshall. Yeah, you can argue he was trying to avoid making a decision, but in the end, he did something far more effective. And this is why he's known as the greatest Supreme Court Chief Justice. Every other Supreme Court Chief Justice has modeled, and they want to be remembered as much as John Marshall. He's so instrumental. Remember, he's not the first. John Jay was the first. Nobody remembers John Jay because it doesn't do anything under Washington. But John Marshall makes this decision, and then after that, he sets up judicial review. Now he's a busy guy because now he has a job, and now he has a reason, a purpose for the Supreme Court to judge things constitutional or unconstitutional. So Jefferson does have domestic, which means stuff inside the country he deals with. He's going to set out to get rid of the national debt. Anytime there's a national debt, he believes that increases the power of the federal government. Because if there's a debt, people owe the government, or the government owes, it becomes a power for them. Corruption, the high taxes, it means that in order to pay debt, you have to pay more in taxes. It causes corruption. We have money shifted around like that. It's just people are inevitable going to be corrupt in that sense. He gets rid of whiskey tax, thing he's always promised and always hated. He cuts military expenses. Later on, I'll probably skip a couple of slides. He goes into too much detail, but he's cutting the military. What little navy we have, he's just cutting through it as fast as possible. And in 1808, he's credited with outlawing the international slave trade, something he suggested in his 1806 State of the Union. But just before you get all happy and think he's the righteous man he is, in the American Revolution, every state actually got rid of international slave trade. And afterwards, only 3 actually opened up. And at this point, South Carolina, what I call the butt of America, they're the only ones doing it, redoing it. And so the international slave trade was on its way out. It was too harsh, even by American and British standards. British were already doing this as well. Now, what that means is you won't have the Middle Passage anymore. But that also means that slaves in the southern colonies, or not colonies, but the southern United States, they're going to be worth more money. And so you're going to have the domestic slave trade increase greatly, especially when you open up new land. And that new land, they bring more and more of these people in chains. So the domestic slave trade, it's very much alive and well. And this is going to be eventually the slaves will be worth more than all the money in all the factories in the North. In the South, a slave is worth more than that. A slave was like owning a very nice car. If you want to see the equivalent of money-wise, that's how hard it was to own a slave, was to pay cash for a car. That's how expensive slaves actually gotten, and that's a big reason why the South did not want to get rid of it. That's just immediately taking away your assets, essentially. But Jefferson will get credit for that. Biggest credit he gets is the Louisiana Purchase, and we all know this story. It goes back to Louisiana Territory. Jefferson sends a negotiator to New Orleans. He wants to send France. He wants to buy New Orleans for $10 million. He's willing to buy New Orleans for $10 million, just a little port, to avoid any more problems that we're having with the Spanish or French. And you think, well, why does he go to the French if it's Spanish territory? Well, this is the point in time when Napoleon is just dominating the world, essentially Europe and the world. And at this point, Napoleon has pretty much given up on his colonies in the Western Hemisphere. In the Americas, he's given up on them. The French have overtaken Spanish colonies, and the French have their own islands as well. And after the slave revolt in the Caribbean, essentially, it's not worth the trouble for Napoleon, and he needs cash for his revolution and his conquering of Europe at the time. So he's more than willing to get a little bit more money. He's going to actually offer $15 million for all of the Louisiana territory altogether. Now Jefferson sits down, he gets word of this, and of course it's no brainer. You buy it; it's 3 cents an acre. You can buy one city for $10 million. Why wouldn't you buy all Louisiana territory for $15 million? What Jefferson thinks about it, he says, hey, nowhere in the Constitution does it say I can expand the United States this much. Nowhere does it say I can do this. And essentially, Jefferson has to deal with that, and he is a strict Constitution man. Remember, that's the whole point of the Republicans. They say you have to follow Constitution word for word. I see nothing in here saying he can do this, but Jefferson will do it anyways. And he actually says, "I hope future generations can forgive me," and he'll actually make that purchase and be pretty fair well off from it. Now it's 1804. This is his election year, but before his election year, he's going to send out Lewis and Clark to explore this territory. 2.5-year journey. They make their way. They're actually going to meet a Native American named Sacagaway. She's going to be their guide along the way. They meet her early on. There's a funny, hilarious drunk history on this. As these names sound familiar, Clark is actually the brother of George Clark, the crazy frontiersman we talked about during the American Revolution. They're actually brothers. And on the journey, Clark will actually stop and meet up with his brother who's not doing too well. Lewis and Clark, incredible story about how through all odds they make it through all the way to the coastline, and they write about all this fauna, all this the routes and the rivers and all this stuff. Dangerous times. Sacagaway saves them multiple times, but nonetheless, when they get back, they cannot get paid from this. They cannot get paid at all. And there's a huge conspiracy stories about some of the stuff. When we look at Lewis and Clark, exactly what happens to them afterwards. There's mystery behind one of their deaths. But not to promote conspiracy theories in this class, but you can look that up yourself. Essentially, but they don't get paid. Jefferson does not come through with that and actually pay them. It's pretty ridiculous. But long story short, they're going to explore that area. And Jefferson pushed for them to do that. It really meant a lot for him to understand what exactly the United States has just bought. But nonetheless, that's in the Lewis and Clark expedition. Pretty extraordinary if you imagine going to a place nobody's ever been and trying to figure out how to get through it. Political schemes have come up. I've actually talked about this before, but the Hamilton and Burr duel is going to take place during Jefferson, while Jefferson's president. Burr, if you remember, he was running against Jefferson, and it went to the House of Representatives because it was a tie. Technically, it was Adams and his VP running against Jefferson and his VP. But the way it worked back then is everybody got electoral votes. And then the top two became president and vice president. It wasn't like it is today where you actually vote for the party itself. You vote for both guys. It wasn't like that back then. That had to be an amendment to change it because of this election, actually. But Burr is the VP to Jefferson only because Jefferson won in a tie. But Jefferson does not trust Burr. He's actually relinquished him of all duties and just told him pretty much you go on your own. You're not doing anything as VP. Jefferson doesn't trust him, actually keeps an eye on him. So by 1804, in this re-election, everybody knows Jefferson's not going to pick Burr for his vice president. Burr's only there because the way the Constitution used to be. So Burr decides to run for New York governor, and he's going to run against a no-name. That should have been an easy win. But once again, Hamilton has been asked what he thinks of it. Of course, Hamilton lives in New York. This is his home state now. He's not from New York, but it becomes his home. And apparently there was a letter published in a local newspaper from one man to another. It's actually Hamilton's father-in-law. And that letter was published, and it's quotes that Hamilton had said of Burr by those two men. And Burr writes a letter. Hamilton demands that you tell me about this, and is it true? And Hamilton says, if you're going to ask me questions, you should ask about what I said, not about what they said. I said. And which one do you want? So I've been saying this stuff for 30 years. And Burr pretty much warns him, you better watch out. And Hamilton, or what kind of thing. And they push back and forth in letters. And eventually there's a duel challenge by Burr to Hamilton. Just one quote Hamilton has said of Burr: he's a dangerous man, one who ought not to be trusted with the reins of government. Technically, that quote comes from Burr running for president, but Hamilton remained effective on that. If you watch the Disney play or the Hamilton play on Disney Channel, you'll actually wonder when I tell you a story where that's not what they show, and they do portray something entirely different. They portray Burr and Hamilton as being friends but enemies at the same time, and Hamilton and Jefferson hating each other with a passion. And you've got to remember, it was Hamilton and Madison were the ones that wrote the Federalist Papers. So they weren't too far away, and Madison becomes a protege of Jefferson. So these guys are all connected, and Hamilton and Jefferson, despite their political parties, you have to wonder, you have to think that there had to be a mutual respect for them. Burr, it doesn't seem so much. And if you think, hey, Burr's his friend too, no different than Jefferson, he's a founding father as well. Not so much. Burr, if you actually follow him after this duel, after he kills Hamilton, you'll understand Burr's mentality, and you probably won't believe him as much. This duel itself has been called into question. Some historians have said Hamilton did not intend to shoot in the air while Burr shot him. The witnesses actually say there's a few seconds between both shots. Nobody knows who fires first. Both sides say something different. But Hamilton's side would say he shot in the air. And according to all records, Hamilton said before to his friends and colleagues in the letters he wrote that he plans on shooting in the air. But some historians have argued, no, Hamilton picked dueling pistols that were bigger, heavier, longer, so he'd be more accurate. He picked these so he can adjust the trigger strength to the point where he just barely pull the trigger and it goes off. It's called a hair trigger. Like just the weight of a hair could make it go off. So it's been argued that he raised his pistol to turn, and when he turned to do it, he accidentally shot it. He didn't intend to do it, shoot in the air, and then Burr returned fire. Massive debate, but a lot of people, we really just don't know. In the end, Burr does kill Hamilton and becomes technically a fugitive. So when you think the president doesn't break the law, or vice president wouldn't break the law, Burr was a murderer. He killed somebody. Dueling was illegal in New York. It was illegal in New Jersey, but they travel over to New Jersey to do this. Because one, in New York, it's punished. The consequences are way worse if you're caught. New Jersey is like a little slap on the wrist, not a big deal. And it's actually the same place where Hamilton's son was actually shot prior to that in a duel. But nonetheless, Burr is going to become a wanted man after that. He actually will get out of New York, New Jersey, avoid it there because he's wanted for murder. He was stay in the South, return to D.C. in this same year to be finished being vice president, and of course ruin that. And he will eventually. A conspiracy goes that he goes to the new Louisiana Territory Purchase, the Louisiana Territory, the new Purchase area, and he will meet with a general there, and he plans on starting his own empire there. That's what's believed. Burr would say, no, we're just starting a colony here. We're heavily armed, but no, we're not going to start a whole empire. So he's going to argue differently, but Jefferson's actually sent full force after him, doesn't believe him, then charging him with treason. He's going to self-exile himself to France. At this point, you're thinking, oh, how did he commit a murder? How could he just go to a different state? Back then, the rules were different how states worked with each other, and they really didn't. Now it's a federal law to commit murder and a state law, right? So the federal government can go after you, which means they can go cross state lines. Then Burr was able to pretty much get away with it. In the end, all those cases were dropped. The argument that they had was Hamilton was shot in New Jersey, but he died in New York. That was a technicality that they used. But in the end, it was like nobody wanted to put the vice president of our country on trial for murder. This is way too young of a country to have this kind of scandal when you think about it. Burr does live out and actually goes to England first. Tries to raise money to start an invasion of Mexico and take over there. England catches wind of it and they're like, no, get out. His idea was to go free Mexico from Spain and start his own empire in Mexico. I don't know if Burr spoke Spanish, but the English will kick him out. He'll try to go to France, and France will deny him, say, nope, we don't want you. You're too much trouble. He goes back to America and actually uses his mother's name for time being. He practiced law for a little bit. At 77, he actually remarries to a woman 19 years younger than him, but she has money. And then she divorces him after just a few months when she finds out that she's 58. She finds out that he's actually spending all her money on land speculation, trying to make money off buying land and turn around selling it for more. So she divorces him, but the papers actually go through the same day he dies. So he does essentially die. But knowing that, you gotta wonder, really, was Burr that honest and that truthful when discussing Hamilton's duel? Burr was a man that wanted power to have power. He wanted to be in control of some territory empire. He didn't want to lead the people because he believed in it. So, Hamilton's right when he constantly put his money on somebody other than Burr, whether it's Jefferson or the new governor of New York. He always talked against Burr and said, I don't trust him with power. And it's hard to argue against him now. Now, if you're wondering, okay, wait, the Federalist Party, they were so strong on strict interpretation, but they broke that to make the Louisiana Purchase. What happened to the party? Okay, if you're wondering that, it's a good question. Essentially, what happened to the Federalists, some of them break apart. The Federalists break apart because they're going to believe that in a strong central government, cannot have a strict. They want a loose interpretation, so they're okay with the Louisiana Purchase, but they don't look that good. Think about it. Jefferson doubles the size of the country. Is he not going to get reelected? He just doubled the size of the country for a great deal, so he's going to get reelected easily. I'll show you a map in a little bit. He's really reelected by a landslide. Okay. Now, Democrat Republicans, they're going to look at this and say, this is not what we believe. We don't believe in a loose interpretation. And Jefferson broke the Constitution. He shouldn't have done that. And so they're going to split up. The Democrat Republicans actually become a little weaker themselves. Not to the point where they fall apart, but a small faction will break off and they all actually will call themselves the old Republicans. Because I say Jefferson has taken the party somewhere different now. We don't believe in that. They were against Jefferson allowing the bank. That was one thing that Jefferson allowed to continue. He made that promise, if you guys remember, to that congressman in Delaware in order to win the tie in the House for president. Jefferson made a promise. I said, hey, I won't get rid of the bank or anything like that. He did have tariffs, and he stretched the Constitution with the Louisiana Purchase. So the Democrat Republicans, they do have a faction to kind of split off and say, hey, we don't accept this. This isn't okay, and this is not what we're about. Okay. Also, Jefferson does deal with this. We often think that War 1812 is not really beginning this early in 1807, but it actually does. Britain and France are close to going to war. Napoleon is a big issue with him. They both want U.S. to keep trading with them. So Jefferson's president, wars in Europe. You would think he'd be ready to jump in on the side of France. He's always talking about that, helping them, but things are different now. It's not French Revolution that they're fighting for freedom. It's Napoleon, who's a military dictator, that's in charge. So Jefferson isn't all keen on helping France. He's never liked Britain. He's never been a British guy. But he's trying to avoid it altogether. He wants to keep trade open with both of them because that's how we make money. We trade both sides. Great Britain has a navy so large that they need 12,000 men a year to keep it going. So what they're going to do is they're going to capture Americans on the open sea and say, hey, you're pretty much British. We're going to make you a British sailor. You're now part of the British Navy. We call it impressment. You may remember that or heard that term before. That's literally when a British military ship pulled up next to a merchant ship with U.S. sailors on it, literally making money by selling goods, going to port, trading, that type of thing. And the British soldiers would come aboard, take those men, bring them back to the British ship and say, great, now you work for the British Navy. If it sounds like slavery or them capturing them, like kidnapping them, that's what it was. That's exactly what impressment was. The final straw was the Chesapeake. This merchant ship was on its maiden voyage, meaning this first voyage. And within, I think it was roughly a couple of hours, a British ship encountered them, come aboard, take them in. Now, this was illegal because international law, U.S. was neutral, so this was against international law because if somebody declares neutrality, you have to respect that. So Thomas Jefferson has decided what he's going to do, and instead of going to war, he really couldn't have because he slashed the military budget, to be honest. The Navy was horrible. He says, I'm going to starve these two countries and place an embargo on them, meaning we won't trade with them. We won't buy from them. We won't sell to them. That's an embargo of 1807. So his idea is make them both suffer until they both agree to respect our neutrality. Now, what this does, though, is because Americans can't buy goods from Great Britain or France, Americans will start making more on their own. So textiles is a perfect example. We're going to see more and more textiles take off in America to the point where now, since people aren't buying British textiles, they have to buy from Americans. So Americans are making more of it and actually making money. And so this embargo is well known for one of the big things that started U.S. manufacturing. This helps lead up to the Industrial Revolution. U.S. manufacturing had to take off because of the embargo, because we couldn't buy from Britain or France. And so in a sense, we start making everything on our own. So indirectly, it's funny because Jefferson is an agriculture kind of guy. He believes in farms, doesn't like big cities, doesn't like factories or in general. But he actually starts it with the embargo. He actually kind of gets it pushed in that direction. Now, Jefferson is going to finish his term, his second term. He'll be a two-term president. He'll follow the tradition set by Washington and step down. That's a tradition at the time. It's not law. Now it's law. Now it was passed with 22nd Amendment after World War II. But at this point in time, it was just tradition. You serve 2 terms and you stop. And to be honest, I'm pretty sure 8 years of being president was enough for anybody. Madison comes in, and so Madison has adopted this problem, this embargo, this issue. He's going to step in. He's going to try to go negotiate with Great Britain. It fails miserably. It's actually an embarrassment the way they treat and talk to us. Madison retaliates and kicks out the Great Britain ambassador out of America. That's his response. But Napoleon is in charge with France in full force. And so there's a few years of peace between us and the French. Napoleon is not trying to engage in war with us. He never does. His main goal is Europe and conquer Europe, right? He didn't really care about the Western Hemisphere. It's too much of a reach for him. So it's our main problem is Great Britain. And essentially, the U.S. will declare war. It's not one instant. A lot of times wars have one thing that causes it. This was built up a time again and again and again of 2 things. One, impressment. Right there we have the violation of American shipping rights, essentially constantly the British Navy are taking boarding American ships and kidnapping our people and making them British sailors in the British Navy. So that's impressment is our number one cause. Number two, the British are really instigating attacks, telling Native Americans on the frontiers to attack the Americans. The British actually still have forts and soldiers in America, and this is 1812. All right, this is 20 years later. They still won't get out of our country. And so when Madison goes to ask for declaration of war, he sees no other choice. The House of Representatives, they vote 79-49, yes. And the Senate votes 19-13, yes. We'll go to war with Great Britain. And so America has now entered its first official war since their own independence. Now, how are they prepared for this? It's not good. Not good at all. The War of 1812, obviously, is in 1812. This is Madison's third year as president. He's dealing with this. He comes in office in 1809. He's elected in 1808, comes in office in 1809 in that March. And he's dealing with this issue. When he became president, the National Bank expired. You see, it was a charter. That's one way Hamilton got it accepted in Congress, was it would have a 20-year charter. And sure enough, 20 years are up, and Congress does not renew that charter. They let the National Bank expire. So the first National Bank is done. So we don't have anywhere to get funds or borrow money from. Jefferson had cut the military, only 3,000 troops at the beginning of this. Congress actually authorizes 35,000 more troops for this war, but only 18,500 actually show up. 18,000 actually show up. So we can't even recruit enough people to join us to fight the British. If you think about a Navy, how strong is a Navy? We've got 16 ships compared to Great Britain's 600 ships. So just alone on paper, you should look at this and say, we're not prepared, right? This whole idea of not strengthening the federal government has its consequences. And in this case, with no arms, barely even a standing army, with no bank to pull funds from, with a very slim Navy, the federal government can't really protect us like it's supposed to. And while that's not Madison's fault, he's going to be to blame for that because he's president, right? Okay, so the War of 1812 was a continental war. Once we declare war on Great Britain, we've got to figure out how we're going to attack them. We don't have a strong Navy, as we point out here, especially compared to theirs. We don't have much of a military as we even try to raise men. We can only get 18,000 to volunteer. It would seem the War of 1812 doesn't inspire as many people as the American Revolution did, or at least not the same way. Having said that, we've got three different spots where we're going to fight this war against the British. Andrew Jackson will be in the southeast of the U.S., down near New Orleans. At sea between both navies, as weak as that part of the war is, and along the Great Lakes region. Now, the Great Lakes region, pretty much it became a naval war battle on the Great Lakes. Theoretically, it makes sense. We're going to attack Great Britain. We're at war with Great Britain. We want to attack them. We can't get across the ocean and do that. So we're going to attack them in Canada, where the British have control. We tried 3 times to invade Canada, and the United States failed. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to say that we tried to invade Canada 3 times and failed. Mainly it was a naval battle in the Great Lakes. That actually, because of this, after the War of 1812, there was a buildup of a navy for us and the British. Both are building our navies on the Great Lakes because of the War of 1812, just in case we go to war again. At the time, I don't think anybody really thought that would be an issue. Next, we have the war in the South, specifically down in New Orleans. A man by the name of Andrew Jackson will come to... All right, sorry about that. Okay, so as I said, the 3 places that we're going to fight this war on at sea between both navies, as weak as that is, it's kind of a joke more than anything. You can actually see from the map the blockade British puts around us. Along the Great Lakes, which was kind of a joke when it came to the battles there, the naval battles on the Great Lakes. And then the biggest that you probably know is the war in the South, led by Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was made an orphan. Actually, his whole family was killed in the American Revolution fighting. He was actually taken aboard one of those ships. He was treated horribly by the British at the age of 13. Supposedly, he spit on one of the British commanders who demanded that he shine his shoes. There's a whole bunch of rumors about this young Andrew Jackson. At this point, he's going to take a volunteer force and head south. Because what happened at Fort Mims was a massacre against Americans and what your book calls White Creeks. Essentially, the Creeks were Native American tribe, Native American groups of people, actually in the area, not a specific tribe, but groups of people in the area. And some of them had adapted to the American ways and actually were living at the fort with Americans, living the standard American life. And there became not anything other than the British really pushing for this attack. Natives, other Creeks that did not conform to the Americans' viewpoints of life would attack them. In the end, it was really the general's fault of the fort. He was drunk. He ignored calls. Like two slaves even said that when they're out of the fort, they saw a man with painted faces. And the general of the fort actually had one of them beat for lying. And then somebody else later said they saw some Native Americans in the area. And the general was so drunk, he just ignored it. So essentially what ends up happening is that the Creeks would attack the fort and kill, murder, massacre 553 people. So it became essentially a massacre. The British were behind this. The British were pushing for the Creeks to do this. Essentially, that comes back to Tennessee. Andrew Jackson raises a voluntary force and then go down and start killing any Native Americans they can find along the way. That would be one thing that made him famous would be the Horseshoe Bend. After the massacre, he commits himself there, the killing of women, children, Native Americans. He'll be promoted to Major General. And just so you understand how they view Native Americans, it's pretty bad. I have highlighted one part, they shot them like dogs. They'll talk about how they burned down houses and just waited for the Native Americans to come running out from the fire and then just shooting them, including old women, as this once said. The troops would take bridle reins from the skin of Indian corpses. The reins that they use for horses, to pull back on horses, they actually use skin from Native Americans to make some of those. And they rode around with those. They did a body count by going around cutting off every nose of Native American and throwing in a pile and counting the noses. Then they would send their clothing that they caught from Native Americans after they killed them back to the ladies of Tennessee, as quoted in your book, as souvenirs. And if you think that maybe there's just a bunch of crazies, keep in mind your heroes, Sam Houston and Davy Crockett, were there as well. They were actually both friends of Andrew Jackson, if you did not know that. Davy Crockett would be a friend for him for life almost. Sam Houston kind of drifts away from him, but later on. But this was a Horseshoe Bend battle. It was nothing short of just a murdering by these volunteer force from Tennessee. And after that, Andrew Jackson's made promoted into actual officer position in the military, and he's going to go down to New Orleans. In the meantime of that massacre, we do have the British land in D.C. They're going to capture D.C. and burn it to the ground. James Madison escapes to the point where the British troops reportedly said when they got to the White House, the food was still warm. That it looks like the president and his wife were about to sit down and eat. They were able to eat the food, destroy everything, and burn it down. Madison makes it out, and on his way out, he grabs the U.S. Constitution. And his wife actually grabs a portrait of Washington. It's actually the famous portrait of Washington you've seen, so that they can't destroy it. It's embarrassment, flat out embarrassment. You're the leader of a country, and you have to run away. It would turn out it's pretty interesting when they look at it how it happened so fast before they knew it. There were like no soldiers in the city, and they had to get the president's wife out. It's actually pretty close when you look at it. Have you ever heard people say that that's why they paint the White House white to cover the burn marks? That's actually a myth. White was the best color at the time for limestone, which is what they used. So that's actually why I was painting white, not the burn marks. That's a myth. And even the White House Museum says that's a myth. Great Britain does go a little bit farther north. You might not understand this, but Baltimore is just very north of D.C. That whole area is connected with subways and public transportation. It's a giant, like 1/8 of the U.S. population is in that one small area. But Great Britain will go up north and they will bomb a fort in Fort McHenry. Well, right before they started bombing this fort, they had a prisoner, a doctor on board. And he was a doctor that was well loved in Baltimore, and people loved him. And people wanted to get him out of prison from there. And so they hire a lawyer to actually go do that. That lawyer's name is Francis Scott Key. He goes aboard the ship. He negotiates for his release. And this is when the stories get kind of sketchy. Francis Scott Key will say that he was on board, overheard their plan to start bombing, and they wouldn't let him off the ship until they bombed the fort. The British will say, no, we kept them on board because if we let them go at that time and they got on shore and we started bombing, they would be protected. So we did it for their own protection. Either way, what happened was Francis Scott Key is stuck on the ship with that doctor. But Francis Scott Key, the lawyer, is stuck on the ship. They bombard the fort. And the next morning, Francis Scott Key looks out to see what became of the fort, and he sees the American flag waving. And so he writes the Star Spangled Banner poem, and later on it's put to a drinking song, as a matter of fact, and it becomes our national anthem. So our national anthem didn't come from the American Revolution. It actually came from War of 1812. And it took years before that actually became a national anthem. It didn't happen like overnight or anything like that. That's actually where our national anthem came from. It's a poem and bar song put together, essentially. If you ever go, that's pretty cool. They have a whole scene where you take this tour, you watch this short video, and then all of a sudden the wall opens up and it's a giant glass window that's like 2 stories tall, and you see this huge flag waving there that coincides perfectly with the end of the song. It's well played if you ever get a chance to visit. Pretty interesting. That's Fort McHenry with Francis Scott Key witnessing the flag still waving, right? So now we have the war. In the War of 1812, we have the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson has arrived to the mouth of the Mississippi River, New Orleans. He is going to defend it well. He's on higher ground. They actually had to point their cannons downward. And when you read about this battle, the British pretty much beat themselves. It was horrible. Like the way they actually were stuck and trying to get around land and put ships on land and then back in the water. It's pretty crazy what they tried to do. And it was stupid for them to make that attack. It was everything dumb the British could ever do. Those in charge at the time. The British would call it never was a more complete failure done in war. But essentially what's crazy is Jackson beats the crap out of the British. This is really America's only victory in this whole war. Everything else was pretty bad, pretty embarrassing. But the Battle of New Orleans was a huge victory. But it actually didn't even matter because a treaty was signed before this battle. But remember how long it takes for communication to arrive across the ocean and down through the colonies to even get there? So this battle should actually never taken place. So when that treaty was even reached or agreed upon, it wasn't favorable for the United States because we were in the short end of that. So the treaty again is signed at the end after the war had actually technically already ended, but it gave Americans a little bit of pride, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. What also happens is less known because you probably know about New Orleans and how it happened, even though the war is over, and it gave Andrew Jackson a sense of fame. What also happened is the Hartford Convention. You may have not known this, but in the War of 1812, New England was pretty much all that was left of those Federalists, right? The Republicans have pretty much dominated politics across the board. Remember, we said Federalists, like back in 1800, they had pretty much just retired into the judicial branch. Well, that's all the Federalists. Only ones that actually remain that actually support them are still up in New England area. Very few states actually support or dominate Federalists. Everybody's Democrat, Republican. Well, the Hartford Convention, these Federalists got together and they decided what they were trying to figure out what they were going to do about these Democrat Republicans. Massachusetts and Connecticut up in New England, they refused to give militiamen for the fight. Many of those in New England actually still sold supplies to the British Army, even though that we're at war with them. And at the Hartford Convention, these Federalists are going to give a whole proposed list of demands for the Democrat Republicans to agree upon. And if you don't agree upon these, we're going to secede from the Union. So New England actually said that they were going to quit the United States first. They were one of the first areas of the country that said that they were actually going to quit. And that's why I actually have this map here. I think it's interesting to see if every area that had ever threatened to secede the United States could easily be broken up. If you look at how New England had threatened here, the South in Civil War, what if Texas had not become part of the United States and stayed its own country? It would be that big. Even California, it was found as a California Republic, as short as it was, it could have been its own country. So it's actually interesting when you see what America might have ended up looking like from that point of view. But they threatened this. Little known to them, they didn't know the treaty had been signed already as well, and these demands that they made were a joke because the war was over. So, and after the Battle of New Orleans, it created a sense of pride. And even though America had really lost that war, we didn't win many battles at all. The only battle we won was New Orleans. It was after the war was over. That's not what Americans felt. They had just had a huge victory, and that's what they remember. That's what they felt. You can tell them whenever that treaty was signed, they weren't paying attention. They were so happy with the Battle of New Orleans. So it's kind of a joke. And this is pretty much kills the Federalists. If you're wondering what the demands were, there were several demands. One of them was the president would serve one term for 6 years. That was it. Stuff like that, just because they were upset that the Democrat Republicans kept getting Virginians in as president. So it's interesting to see what could have happened. But Hartford Convention is when the Federalists got together, made these demands without realizing, crap, the war is over, the treaty's been signed, now we look stupid. So it was pretty bad for them. So in the end, the War of 1812, summarize it all up. This is often called the Second War of Independence. There's a nickname given to this because the American Revolution in 76 to 81, technically 83, we were separated from Britain, but nobody really felt that way. It was this kind of sense of, okay, we're separate, but I think even the British thought, you'll be back. They kind of gave that attitude. That's why the British never declared war of 1812. They were just doing whatever they wanted to us. But this proved, we did it again, we're not going back to British rule. This isn't temporary. So it's often called Second War of Independence, or sometimes people just refer to it as like the second part, part two. It needed to be finished. A big thing about this, it goes all the way back to embargo. So you had the embargo of 1807, where we refused to trade with France and England, so we manufacture our own goods. That started the Industrial Revolution. Then the War of 1812, we surely couldn't buy from Great Britain then. We were at war with them. So this helped fuel the Industrial Revolution. So when we're talking about, hey, what helped start the U.S.'s first ever Industrial Revolution, it was an embargo and the embargo of 1807 and this War of 1812. And then the biggest thing that's most confusing for you is the reversal of the Federalists and the Republicans. If you notice what I'm about to read to you, the Republicans, everything they believed after this war is turned around. Because Republicans before were the ones that are big on state government, but not big on national government. But now, after this, Republicans learned nationalism, this pride of being American, not just Virginian, not just South Carolina, but American. Madison will actually charter the second national bank. So the first national bank died because the Democrat Republicans refused to renew it. It meant too much power to the federal government. They hated it. It was a Jeffersonian thing. They hated it. Just like Jefferson, they hated the idea of the bank. Madison is going to charter a second bank because he realizes we need this. So in 1816, he'll charter another one for 20 more years. And all of a sudden now, these Democrat Republicans believe we need tariffs. We got to help the U.S. manufacturing more. We have to help the Industrial Revolution. That's good for us. So we're going to have tariffs so Americans buy American products and we can industrialize and make more on our own. Madison also wants internal improvements. He realizes the problem with the roads in America and transportation for supplies, the troops is so horrible, so bad. But he believes he needs an amendment. He needs nowhere in the Constitution to say the federal government can make a road across the state lines or anything like that. So he believes that there should be an amendment allowing the federal government to spend money on internal improvements, bridges, roads, etc., and canals, whatever it might be. And now Federalists, those guys that think Federalists were like Hamilton, they want a loose interpretation of the Constitution so that they could twist it or make it work. They want to be flexible. Now Federalists say, no, we want a strict interpretation in order so that they can stop Madison from doing what he wants. So if you're ever thinking about now time politics, how it's really ridiculous how Republicans would do something or not let Democrats do something, and then 4 years later, they do the exact same thing. Kind of thing's been happening for a while now, for a couple hundred years, if you just look at the results of the War of 1812. That summarizes Chapter 7. I'll leave you with this image from that. But this is going to also end Unit 2. So Unit 2 test will be over 5, 6, and 7. Hope you enjoyed.